Hey everybody, welcome back. My name is Matt, or Cryptic if you prefer. This is part 4 in the series on the Vader project. This is also the last video. I do want to preface this. Some of the video got corrupted and I lost a portion of it, so you will notice a bit of a jump. But we're now getting our textures and materials assigned from Substance Painter that we exported out in the last video, and we're getting them assigned to our Saber in here. The way I like to do this is I will run through the model and I will, in the hypershade, select the materials that I set up for Substance Painter. When you right click on those materials that you set up in the hypershade, you can actually select all assigned objects, and it'll allow you to just select everything and then assign your new AI standard surface material, which is what I'll be using in this video. One of the biggest things that I like to do is I will get my AI standard surfaces set up and named, and then I will go through and just delete the old materials. You don't necessarily have to do this, but for me, it's just an important step to make sure I'm staying organized. With the creation of all these materials, you're just kind of setting up your scene so you can go through and quickly import them. There are some people who have developed scripts to do this. I haven't really played with them all that much, but I do know there are scripts you can use to run through and kind of automatically do this. It depends also on how you set up your project. With this model, I did not set up a project scene, so I kind of screwed myself there. That's just a little tidbit, but I'm basically just going through and getting all my materials added. If you do have questions on how to add your materials to Substance Painter, or from Substance Painter to Maya anyway, I will be releasing a tutorial soon on how I do this and how I get through and get everything configured so that it looks the same as it did in Substance Painter, because it's something that for me took a while to figure out. Right now I'm going through and adding the displacement map. There is no default way to add the displacement map outside of the hypershade, so you do actually have to open hypershade. I know that's kind of a daunting task for some people because it's visual programming and it's kind of a big thing to go and undertake. I do find that over time I've learned a little bit more about it, and it gets a little bit easier as you go, but for some of these maps I did want to make sure I was including the height map because it was an important detail that I added, and I didn't want to lose it with Maya. So basically throughout this entire process, you go through, you add your materials, and because we set up our AI materials the way we did, it gets pretty quick and pretty easy to just run through and add them. Sometimes you will get some weird visual issues. A lot of the times you just need to make sure you went back and you set the settings properly in the material attributes, but most of the time everything will just carry over fine. It's important to note that when you export your materials from Substance Painter, make sure they're all in the same folder. Make sure they're easily accessible. Again, I probably should have had a project folder, but I didn't for this scene just because I was kind of almost rushing near the end of this. I don't want to say I rushed the final image because I didn't. I spent a good amount of time doing look dev on it, but I do think I rushed as far as like keeping my scene organized. One of the things as a beginning artist, if you don't understand, once you start assigning your metallic texture files to the object, you'll notice your objects basically go black. This is normal. This is going to happen. You just have to kind of trust it, and then once you render, you'll see the result that you were looking for. A lot of the times you can kind of get a good rendition by looking at your hypershade. You can look at the kind of the preview asset that shows you what your texture looks like. You can see that the things that you're applying are working. Just trust that they're actually being assigned and they're working properly, because I know that trips a lot of people up. They're like, why is my project black? Why can't I see the colors? It's because of that metallic map, and as far as I know, there's no real way to turn that off. This has got to be one of the more tedious processes I don't enjoy, is adding all the materials back. It also depends on how complex your object was. With this one, I had a good probably 10 to 12 different textured assets, so it kind of took a little bit longer to apply everything. But the nice thing is once you're done with this, you can adjust anything the way you need to. It's also just really important to remember to go through and keep things organized. Make sure that you have named your textures. I wouldn't necessarily go through and name all your texture files. You can. I never really have found that as part of my process, but I could see why you would want it to be. But it's not something I usually concern myself with. You'll notice I changed a lot of these settings. One of the main things I'm changing is the color space. Some of the textures that are imported or exported from Substance Painter need to be set up as a raw color space. The other thing is you need to change the alpha's luminance option. It's basically checking it for everything but a bump map, and then when you get down to a normal map, you need to uncheck it from the normal map. And that'll give you kind of your basic setup that allows you to get your materials to look just like they did in Substance Painter. I know that's something I struggled with for a long time, and I had originally given up on Substance Painter because I couldn't figure it out. I didn't understand why my stuff never looked like it did. It kind of came down to A, I didn't know anything about lighting at the time, and B, I didn't know how to actually apply these files because they just were not giving me the look that I was actually trying to achieve. Once all these materials are assigned and good to go, this is where I started to play with lighting. I'll generally do a very basic 3-point lighting setup, and we'll see that here in just a minute. Once again, you can see how the metallic material just kind of really tanks the texture in the viewport. It's just, again, not something to be super worried about. So this is where I start to set up my 3-point lighting system. Just remember, with 3-point lighting systems, your backlight is your lowest intensity light and your key light is your highest intensity light. And so this is my basic scene. I went through just to do a test render to see what I was looking at, making sure everything was applied properly. And then from here, I'll just adjust a couple of settings in my lights. Really, the only value I tend to play with here is the exposure setting under the Arnold tab. This just allows me to kind of figure out what it is I'm doing. I don't really know why that button was showing up gray here. I know that issue kind of self-resolved, but I think it was just because of the way I had the lighting set up. And this was just me running through and testing just to make sure that I had all of my stuff applied, everything was working, and everything looked the way it should, and I wasn't getting any weird visual details or visual errors. If you didn't know, Arnold has a built-in viewport GPU renderer or CPU renderer. I have this set up to GPU right now, so it's running off of my RTX 3070. This is a really good and really easy way to quickly get results and see what you're working with. A lot of people just don't know that this is an option, and it's something I use regularly. So here's where I decided to start modeling the environment. I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do with the environment, so I just kind of settled on a kind of a basic Star Wars-y looking environment. I did these large tiles. And then where the video got corrupted is where I actually built the wall panels. The wall panels are built to mimic the kind of weird lighting panels that you'll see throughout Star Wars. And then just another generic like wall panel. Just because I don't have anything like currently set up for myself. As far as like kit bashing goes for like Star Wars related environments, I just kind of threw things together. And honestly, I love the end result. It turned out a lot cooler than I thought it was going to. So I guess I'm kind of happy about that. But unfortunately, I did lose the process of modeling those. So if you guys are ever interested, I guess I could do a video on that as well. But right here, just going through UVing. Sometimes with these projects, what I'll do is I'll just quickly do a UV on them. I'll export them into a Substance Painter and just do a basic material on them. And you'll see that's what I do here. So I'm going through the same process I went through in the last video, which is just laying out my UVs, adding a color identifier to them and getting them into Substance Painter. And then quickly renaming them. I very quickly near the end of this stopped caring about organization, just because I didn't need to. But all I did was pull this into Substance Painter. I believe I applied just a basic smart material. Yeah, it was just a basic, like, I think it was is it the cobalt? No, actually, I went with plastic. The plastic gave me the sheen that I liked, and then I just added a little dirt material and just kind of played with the coloring and adjustments on it. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on the environment just because sometimes I don't feel like I need to. Depending on what you're going for, I'm just looking for kind of like a diorama display type deal. So for this, I just wanted to add a little bit of dust, just something to dirty it up a little bit to make it not look so clean. And this gave me the look that I was looking for, and I was able to just pull this into Maya really quickly and get it all set up. And then we're following the same process here. We're just exporting our textures. And that's unfortunately where the video corrupted before I built the light panel. So what I'm doing here right now is I'm building a back portion of the light panel, because if you ever look at these, they're white. And the only thing I'm adjusting on these is the emission, just to give that like white bounce off of the floor. And then I quickly started playing with lighting, changing color. I knew I wanted to have a little bit of red in the scene, so I decided to make my key light red and then move it a little bit further off. Then I was playing with my backlight. The problem with the backlight is A, it was showing up in my specular reflections, and I didn't really want that. But B, I also wanted the walls to handle being my backlight. So I ended up pulling the back-facing portion of the wall just out a little bit, and then I put 2 lights in there, and I used those to actually be my backlights in the scene. And you can see how that brightens up and made it look a lot more lively from that point. From here, the next part that I really started focusing on was taking a look at the scene configuration itself and just making sure that everything was lining up the way I wanted to, and I had it framed properly. And a lot of this time is spent rendering and watching a render and just kind of figuring out what I need to adjust and where I want to change. This is where I decided to add an HDRI that I pulled from Polyhaven. I decided to go with just like a basic studio setup, because if you're thinking about the way they would have filmed this, it would have been in a basic studio setup or a virtual setup like they would nowadays. But I decided to go with like a photography studio. And then I just adjusted the settings on my IBL light and really just kind of pull down the exposure a little bit. That way it wasn't super bright, but it was still adding those bounce reflections that I wanted. And it still kind of adds like a nice grounding layer to the scene. You have some realistic reflections in there, and you have some things that are pulling that wouldn't necessarily have been there unless you actually modeled out the objects themselves. Now I'm just kind of adding a little bit of a red glow to the end of the hilt. I wanted this to be like the lightsaber was just on, and you just turned it off and dropped it, and it was still smoking from the heat. So I wanted to just kind of add that reddish glow. And this is one of those things that you could have, I could have just blasted this thing, but I decided not to. This is where I decided to play with something new. I was originally going to just Photoshop in some sort of gas plume, but I decided that I wanted to play with Bifrost a little bit because I've never used it. I'm used to Maya's old fluid simulation system, which is long gone, and Bifrost really took over for that. This was very much an experimental process for me. I have never played with Bifrost. I did a lot of toying with it. I'm still pretty new to their visual programming language that they have set up for this thing. What I did end up doing with this, and you'll see, is I ended up using the cigarette smoke built in that they kind of include with Bifrost as like an example file, and then I went through and changed a bunch of settings on it and just kind of played with what I could. These simulations are pretty heavy to run, which is also why this video doesn't contain a huge in-depth look at the way I did Bifrost. Is just because this thing was actually causing my PC to have an aneurysm. So I really spent what could have been a lot of time look deving on this Bifrost, and I feel like this part of the project definitely took me the longest just because I couldn't figure out what I was doing. There's not a lot of tutorials on Bifrost, so as I learn it, I'm going to try to provide that for you guys as well, because I feel like it's a super powerful tool that not a lot of people talk about. This is about where I decided, I'm going to give up on trying to make my own fluid simulation. I was following a couple tutorials to try to figure it out and learn how the programming works, but in the end I ended up giving up on it and just using what Maya kind of gives you by default, just because it was going to be an easier way to get to where I needed to get. And honestly, the result was pretty good. You can change a simulation a lot by having it interact with environmental variables, and what I did was I had the sphere inside the lightsaber be kind of my point of origin, which would be your emitter, and then I changed the cone of the lightsaber, or the front of the lightsaber, to be the kind of collision item. So by just having it collide with that, it really changes the simulation and really gives you a whole different look, because you have this smoke kind of creeping out of it. And you can see as I started to play with this and adjust it, I started toying with the color and really just experimenting with Bifrost. All of this was an experiment. I do not know much about fluid simulation, and it's something I'm still trying to learn. I think it's also important, though, as we go through these projects and as we go through things, always find ways to challenge yourself. For me, I challenged myself pretty heavily with Substance Painter in this project, as well as Bifrost. Everything else is just kind of a standard process for me now, but I'm trying to find more and more things that are going to make it more difficult for me to complete these projects, because in the end, I've got the artistic direction, but as far as the tools, I want to know more about the tools. Right here, I was getting way too plumy of a smoke, and then Maya crashed, so that was cool. I found out pretty quickly, too, that Maya does not like to GPU render the Bifrost simulations. I don't know why. There wasn't a whole lot of information available on that. But this is where I used the cigarette simulation, and I just called it good. Because I was getting frustrated. I went through like 4 or 5 different crashes before I just kind of gave up on it. But overall, the entire scene was generated in Maya, and I did end up rendering it with CPU instead of GPU, which took an ungodly amount of time for one frame. But the end result was really pretty. I'm still trying to figure out why I was having so many crashing issues, but that's something I troubleshoot offline. I'm not gonna put that in a video just because it doesn't really make much sense. You can tell that after a setting I adjusted, I was having a real hard time getting this thing to collide properly. But I did finally get it to collide with the inside cone. It was partially doing it, which is what was strange, is it was sending a lot of the smoke through the model, but it was still partially colliding with it, so I just had to figure out what setting I needed to adjust to get that to do what I needed it to. I was working with a very wispy smoke at the time, so I couldn't really tell what it was doing. Once I changed the color, that made it a little bit easier. And then from here, I just kind of adjusted a few settings and just played with like the velocity of the smoke and the environmental interaction with it. Nothing too crazy, but something that was just enough to get me the result that I wanted. One of the biggest things I learned is that caching for this is very different than it used to be for the older fluid simulation program. You used to be able to just hit a button and say, hey, cache this for me. This one requires its own visual node that you have to run through and run the cache, save the cache, and then reapply the cache. It's very tedious, so I'm not sure how much I'll use Bifrost in the future, but obviously I want to still learn it and work with it because it is such a powerful tool, and I feel like a lot of people outside of the VFX industry don't touch it. If you're familiar with 3ds Max or some of the other applications, there's a really great plugin for fluid sims. It's called Fume Effects. I used to use that a lot back in the day, and it was definitely pretty intuitive. I don't know how it is nowadays, but it's a good tool to look at if you're interested in doing smoke simulations on the fly like this. It was also a lot faster. I feel like there's probably a way to make Bifrost a little bit faster. I'm a little naive on using it, so. A lot of this video is just me kind of caching through the simulation and playing it. You could see how it was starting to finally gush out the front of it because that velocity was finally hitting it, that wind force. It was kind of pushing it outside of the lightsaber. There's a lot to like learn here and adjust, and so for me to kind of play with this was daunting, but at the same time I learned a lot. So, and I ended up deciding, I think like frame 75 or something like that was the look that I wanted, and so I would pause it there, and then that's where I would do my final render. As you can see though, the lighting system was pretty straightforward on this one. It wasn't very complicated. I didn't spend a whole lot of time adjusting it. As far as lighting goes, I've gotten pretty fast at just setting them up. There's so many things you can play with, but just remember, this is basically a 3-point lighting system. You have your key light, you have your backlighting, and you have your, I think it's called the beauty light. But all I did was I took my backlight, made it into a wall, and then I really focused my key light as the color generator for the scene. This isn't a project that I focus super heavily on like technical lighting like I did with the sunglasses or the Dune project. This project for me, I was just trying to really make something that looked cool and, you know, gave me the satisfaction of completing a project again. Most of this was spent doing this fluid simulation, and unfortunately when it came down to rendering, I just couldn't get this thing to properly render while I was still recording. I'm working on a solution to that so I can record the full process, but it was chugging so hard on my computer, I had to kill it. So there is a lot of the final process of this video that didn't get recorded, unfortunately. But I will try to answer questions as I can if you have them in the comments, just because I know there are a lot of questions when it comes to getting something to look the way this project ended up looking like. But I think it's also just kind of stands to say, like, don't worry so much about having a super technical lighting system. Sometimes the most basic things work. Even in film, when I used to do film, like, our lighting setups were always very simple, but we did what we could to drive them to make them look as cool and as cinematic as possible. And I feel like that was really resonated here. That's the end of this video. Thank you guys so much for watching this series. There'll be one more video, which is just the entire series rendered out in one portion. But I appreciate it. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe because it does help my channel. And I will see you all in the next one.